I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Virginia Postrel and Adam Thierer to you for this next series of talks. We're kind of overflowing with talent today. I should have mentioned at the outset that I think among our four speakers, I counted up about 30 books combined. This is a very booky set of presenters. A lot of books here, a lot of not just academic books that a few people have read. The presenters today that we're hearing from actually write books that lots and lots of people read. And they have fan clubs as well. And Virginia is no exception to that. I mentioned The Future and Its Enemies at the outset, over a quarter century old, still very relevant today, has a very large fan base. I count myself among those fans, and those themes are enduring today. Virginia's a very popular speaker, critic, and author. Her work spans a broad range of topics, from social science to fashion, concentrating on the intersection of culture, commerce, and technology, with an eye toward understanding the personal and social meaning of life in a dynamic and commercial culture. She's a contributing editor at Works in Progress, and you can read her Substack. I think it's vpostrel.substack.com, so sign up for that if you haven't. She's won numerous prizes and awards, and I mentioned The Future and Its Enemies. You should read her other books as well. Her latest, The Fabric of Civilization, How Textiles Made the World, is a really fun read, and I recommend that to you if you haven't seen it. Adam Thierer will follow Virginia after her remarks. He's a senior fellow at the R Street Institute in Washington, D.C. For a long time before that, he was at the Mercatus Center, also in Washington. And Adam's the author of 10 books, and I won't go through all of them right now, but I will say his book, Permissionless Innovation, is one of those books that has had such a widespread impact that people use his language without attributing it to him. And you really know you have an influence when people use your words and forget to attribute them to you, because they might not even know you were the one who gave them those words. If you look in the book that we have today at Deirdre McCloskey's presentation from last year, that chapter, she talks about permissionless innovation, and I don't think she cited you in that as well. So take that as an honor. He's not only a sought-after speaker, he's regularly consulted by members of Congress, the current and past administrations, and business leaders on technology policy. So I'm going to hand it over to Virginia, who has some slides to go with her remarks, and then when she's done, we'll have Adam come up, and then we can take questions for the two of them together. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And I warned Ryan that when I heard that we had a couple of dropouts, I made my talk a little bit. I put back in slides that I'd taken out last night, so hopefully it'll work. Anyway, so as Ryan mentioned, let's make sure I wrote this book in 1998, and the title is an allusion to Karl Popper's much more famous book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And what The Future and Its Enemies is about understanding what I argue is a fundamental political, cultural conflict in society, in our society, that goes beyond it is different from the traditional left and right. And that is a conflict between dynamism and stasis. So I write how we feel about the evolving future, the future that Joel was talking about, tells us who we are as individuals and as a civilization. Do we search for stasis, a regulated, engineered world, or do we embrace dynamism, a world of constant creation, discovery, and competition? Do we value stability and control, or evolution and learning? And dynamism, I use the term in a very specific way, is one way of thinking of it is as a form of liberalism, that is, in the classical sense, that foregrounds learning as opposed to foregrounding justice or foregrounding freedom. Likes all those things too, very important, but learning is the core value. So dynamism has a number of characters. This is my standing on one foot, very brief discussion of it is a liberalism centered on learning and discovery. It has a vision of progress that defines progress as bottom-up, driven by discontent, experimentation, and feedback through competition and criticism. There is constant trial and error. It is not an idea of progress as we're going to this specific understood in advance place. It's an open-ended series of innovations, discontent. It's a trial and error. There's an emphasis on dispersed knowledge. I will not talk about this much today, but it's very important that nobody at the top can understand everything that's important. and it has an idea of simple rules for a complex world, which is a term that I get from Richard Epstein, the legal scholar. So Dynamis rules, I wasn't going to put this in, but my husband, if I don't put it in, he yells at me. Dynamis rules have specific characteristics that encourage this sort of process that Joel is talking about, not only in technological sense, but in more generally. They allow individuals to act on their own knowledge. They apply to simple generic units. They don't have, everything is not in a very, very specific box. They're very generic units so that they allow things to recombine ideas of pieces of land. It could be anything, of contracts in many different ways. They permit commitment. So it's not, you never change, they permit credible, understandable, enduring, and enforceable commitments. They protect criticism, competition, and feedback. And they establish a framework in which people can sort of create nested, competing ideas of rules. So not every institution in society has to be like a dynamist institution. You can have anything from a church to a restaurant franchise that has very specific rules that are not all generic, but they exist within this much larger framework. So one of the ideas in the very last chapter of the book, which I think is very apropos to the initial charge I had for this, which is to talk about sort of American dynamism and the threats and opportunities to it, is the idea of verges. This is an idea from Daniel Boorstin that I think helps explain why America has such a deep dynamism in its culture. A verge is simply one thing coming together with another. It could be two different types of landscapes. It could be two different ethnic groups. It could be two different academic disciplines. It can be anything. He has this very general term, and he writes that America was a land of verges, all sorts of verges between kinds of landscapes or seascapes, between stages of civilization, between ways of thought and ways of life. During our first centuries, we experienced more different kinds of verges and more extensive and more vivid verges than any other great modern nation. In ancient, more settled nations, uniformity, we might also say purity, was idealized. The American situation was different. The creativity, the hope of the nation was in its verges, in its new mixtures and new confusions. And what I want to talk about now is sort of what mixtures have to do with dynamism. And this goes to a big question, which is, how can you have an open-ended idea of progress? How can you even have progress when there's only a limited amount of resources in the world? And often you'll hear we need to, roll back growth, we need to roll back progress because of limited resources. But the thing is, the constraint on what you can invent is not the number of resources in the world. It's not the number of people in the world. It's not even the number of ideas in the world. It's the number of ways those things can be combined. And when you start combining things, possibilities get very big, very fast. So very simple example, 6 Lego blocks, the standard 2x4 bricks. How many ways can you combine 6 Lego blocks? Well, the Lego company used to say that you could combine them about 102 million ways. But then this guy, Soren Eilers, who's a mathematician who went to Legoland in Denmark and started thinking about it, he says, no, that's not right. He did a calculation. It's about 915 million ways. And I, using ChatGPT, went from 2 to 10. And I don't think it was actually doing the calculations. I think it was pulling this from calculations that Lego or perhaps Eilers had done. But when you have 2 bricks, you can only make 4 different combinations. It's a very limited set of possibilities. When you get up to 10, I don't even know the names for this. It's like billions, trillions, quadrillions, 47 quadrillion possibilities. And that's just 10 Lego bricks. And that's like nothing, 10 Lego bricks. I mean, compare back in the day, in the 90s, I used to show computer floppy drives and have how many combinations they could have. When you start talking about bits or atoms or words or music, the possibilities get really, really huge. And so that is the supply side of progress. That's why we can have progress even in a world where the number of the amount of resources are fixed, or that even the population is fixed, which of course is not, but even if we assumed it was. And this is also where the idea of verges comes in, because verges are new ways of combining things. It's like having the experience of things being combined in new ways. I mean, that could even be, experiencing different ethnic cuisines. I'm from Los Angeles, and the stereotypical Los Angeles food would be like, I don't know, kosher burritos or something. It's when you combine different ethnic cuisines. So Joel talked about the importance of tools in driving science. And this is a combination of these are 2 Nobel Prize winners, Drew Weissman and Caitlin Carrico, who won the Nobel Prize for developing the idea of mRNA vaccines. And they represent the combination of 2 academic disciplines. He is a immunologist and she is a biochemist. They also represent how unexpected combinations can come through new tools, because she had to go make some photocopies back in the day, and she had to go over to his building because that's where the Xerox machine was. And so they met at the photocopier and they started talking about their research. And the next thing they know, they have a decades-long research agenda, which he really helped her keep a job, because Penn didn't like her research on mRNA. It was like, they made a bad judgment. Anyway, now they have a Nobel Prize. So that's just, representing interdisciplinary collaboration, and also what the possibilities may be is often hard to anticipate in advance. And I'll also note that she is an immigrant from Hungary. So the open door policy that Joel talked about, she came from after because of troubles with the communist government back in the day. So one of the very important aspects of preserving dynamism is to preserve criticism and competition. I talk in the book about 2 types of criticism. One is criticism, what we think of as criticism by expression, otherwise known as complaining or bitching and moaning, or writing excoriating reviews on Yelp or something. Criticism by expression, which is a verbal process. And then there's criticism by example, which is a more active process, and in many ways a more powerful process. And that in the context of economic dynamism takes the form of entrepreneurship. There is this existing thing in the world. I don't like XYZ about it. I'm going to go out and do something different. Open-ended progress stems from eternal discontent. We're never happy with what exists. As soon as something exists, we find problems with it, and maybe ways to improve it. And that's why progress is open-ended. It's because of this eternal discontent. And over the years, I've observed that when you have a well-grounded social criticism, it often turns into an entrepreneurial opportunity. I'll talk about one in a minute. And another thing, and this is drawing on the work of Eric von Hippel at MIT, or at least he was at MIT when I talked to him, is that often entrepreneurial or technological advances come out of what he calls user innovation. That is, somebody is it could be a bicycle. There is actually a lot in the bicycle industry, or it could be a manufacturing process. They have that deep, intimate knowledge of what it's like to actually use it. And that leads to them saying, well, it would really work better if it was like this. And you often have those sort of frustrated users who are outside. They're users, but they're outsiders to the industry. So I'll give you and competition is very important to spreading new ideas, not only coming up with them, you think you're so great, I can do better, but also, oh, I see the restaurant across the road has redecorated. Maybe I should redecorate too. Or, I see that the nail salon, I'm using homey examples here. I see the nail salon now offers dip nails as well as traditional acrylics and gels. I should get on with that technology too. So competition spreads new ideas. Okay, so this is actually an example from my second book, The Substance of Style, which was published in 2003. Right around the turn of the century, hotel rooms were changing. A nice business hotel, not super fancy, but this is not like the cheap motel. A nice business hotel in, say, 1999, say 1998 when I was going around with the book, would have looked something like this. And there are two things to notice in this picture. One is the rather large armoire holding the not very flat screen TV. And the other is the colored bedspread designed to hide the dirt. Well, along comes a guy, a frequent business traveler who comes out of the real estate industry named Barry Steinhardt. And he says, Sternlicht. Barry Steiner's a totally different person. Thank you. I was like, what is that guy's name? I think it's this Barry Sternlicht, who comes out of the real estate industry, but he gets into the hotel industry through Weston acquisition. He's a deals guy. And he says, this is not how we should be thinking. Thinking as a business traveler, I don't actually like a hotel bedspread that's designed to hide dirt. Think about that. And also, I think we should be putting our money in the bed rather than the armoire, because the armoire, once upon a time, it had been a big innovation by Marriott, but by the turn of the century, TVs were getting flat. You could just put it on the desk. So he instituted changes at Weston, and this is the kind of room that came out of that. You can't see the TV, but it's on the desk. And pretty much every time you go to a hotel nowadays, unless you're on a Route 66 inexpensive classic motel, you will have a white bedspread. They may put some colored pillows and add a little pop of color, but and of course, this also required Weston to develop new housekeeping procedures. I mean, keeping that. I have a white bedspread at home. It would be better if I washed it as often as they do in hotels, but I don't have their kinds of laundry. Anyway, so this is a simple example of that kind of criticism, and then the competition, the innovation as a form of competition, and then this spread because people saw, oh, our competitors are doing this, we should do it too. So that was part. This actually is a heavenly bed. The heavenly bed included the white. So he basically said we should spend our money on the bed. Really good mattress. It should look good. And not on like giant pieces of dark furniture. And that was hugely successful. And then Weston acquired Sheraton, and they did a slightly different thing. Anyway, this spread throughout the industry. So this was around 2000, a little before probably. You could. So this is a super generic stock photo of three women business travelers. And there are at least three innovations in this picture that would have surprised me when I was going around the country talking about the future and its enemies in mostly 1999. The first is probably the most obvious, and that is the cell phone, which is the smartphone, which is behind her coffee cup. The second one is actually rolling luggage. When I went on my book tour in 1999, I had a light. It was ballistic nylon luggage, so it was light. But I had one on each shoulder. One that had my laptop and other sort of work things, and the other had my clothes. Anyway, and then the third is Starbucks. So Starbucks was another one of these things that originated. Somebody went, Howard Schultz went to Italy and he saw how cool the coffee culture was. And he thought, I'm going to bring that back to the U.S. And it's a little complicated, the exact how the business was formed because there was an acquisition and stuff. But he developed Starbucks, and Starbucks spread like lightning and had many, many effects on how Americans live and work and what they drink. I drink Diet Coke because I came from the generation before good coffee. And it also sparked a lot of entrepreneurship by people who actually didn't like Starbucks. They started their own rival coffee places that had a little more character or weren't as corporate. And so today we have about 37,000 coffee houses in the U.S., and Starbucks is fewer than half of those. In 1991, which is when Starbucks really started rolling out nationally, there were only 1,650 coffee houses and 165 Starbucks. So this is, it's not yesterday, but it's not that long ago. A totally different thing. And this came from saying, first he wanted to make the coffee experience better, the coffee better. But then the thing that I mentioned about a valid social criticism leads to an entrepreneurial opportunity. Realized there had been this social criticism, big book called The Great Good Place, written about the lack of what he called third places in American life. And that's a place that's neither your home nor your work, where you can meet people, hang out, and he argued that they were dying out, that, there had been places like bars and barber shops and a whole thing, but that they had been threatened by suburbia. And one of the early sort of strategic pivots that Starbucks did was taking that idea and running with it and creating a place that people could see as a third place. So I want to talk about the current environment, the current situation, and why this is also this idea of criticism and competition as an important form of feedback is very relevant to what we're seeing in the trade debate. And this is a picture not from today, but from the 1980s, where in the 1980s, the trade debate was all about the threat from Japan. I mean, there were members of Congress who were, smashing Japanese consumer electronics in photo ops, but I didn't want to pay for that picture. And there were lots and lots of auto workers protesting. And in fact, there was like a pretty hideous hate crime against the murder of a Chinese American named Vincent Chin, who was mistaken for Japanese in the Detroit area. So it was a really tough, difficult time. The idea was, the auto industry is the pride of America. We should not be letting in these foreign cars. And I don't want to oversimplify, because there were certain things, there were these voluntary restrictions by the Japanese automakers to placate people. But ultimately, Japanese automobile competition changed how all cars are made, like everywhere. And the biggest way it did that was through the Toyota production system, all the things that they introduced, just-in-time management, continuous improvement. They had a whole bunch. They all have names in Japanese. And this spread not only through other auto industries, but it radically transformed top flight manufacturing, not just in Japan, but all around the world. And this was spread by the fact that they were competing globally. So This is not a real picture of, this is a Chat GPT image. They do a really good job of Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren. And I think that what do they have in common? Obviously, they're political enemies and ones, but they are what I call market censors, that prices, market activity are a form of expression. They're just like writing, speech, video, movies, etc., are forms of expression. They tell and they convey a lot of information, whether it's entrepreneurial startups, whether it's price adjustments. That is information that is coming into your society. And people who want to say, you shouldn't be allowed to adjust your prices upward when supplies are shortage. The grocery stores, which have like the world's smallest price, the world's smallest profit margins, are somehow responsible for inflation, or people who want to bring in goods from other countries should be censored. So I think that's a big threat to dynamism. There he is announcing his tariffs. And so there are many, many points to be made against tariffs and in general, and to be made against these tariffs in specific. But the one I want to concentrate on is the idea that they limit the feedback. They limit the criticism that is valuable to the people who are competing with the imported goods. And they also limit the possible combinations. And that's what we're seeing when people talk about this, this American company is now seeing what's going on with its supply chain, which includes, 6 different countries until the thing is finally put together in the U.S. The other thing that's going on, and Joel alluded to this, is a crackdown on immigration. And this is a general crackdown. It's a general sense that just as ideally the U.S. would be a self-sufficient economy, we would be sort of a self-sufficient population, not bringing in people from elsewhere. And my husband actually said some of these crackdowns seem to be almost like when traffic cops or parking cops have a quota, because this is such a bizarre one. She was detained coming back from France with some frog spawn that her boss in the lab at Harvard wanted her to bring back with her, and ordinarily it would have been a fine, but instead she's been in prison since February. She is from Russia, but opposed the Ukrainian war, and then she's also a very valuable scientist. So this is, if you do this a lot, even if it's not the norm, if you have just, one of these cases every week, that's only 52 a year, but it will stifle your ability to draw talent and the combinations you can make with that talent. So this is what I'm afraid the future might look like. Or this. Thanks, I'll quit there. And there's my first book and my last book, most recent book. Thank you.
That's great, Virginia. Thank you. We'll hold questions for Virginia until after our next talk, and I'd like to invite Adam Thierer up, and feel free to use the podium as needed. And then when Adam's concluded, we'll be able to take some questions, and then we'll also welcome Arthur Herman up for the final remarks of the afternoon after that.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's a real pleasure to be here. First of all, let me begin by congratulating you and Civitas for all the wonderful work you're doing here in the institution you're building. It's always exciting to me when we have new institutions brought into the movement that help defend technological freedom and liberty more broadly. So thank you for that, and I wish you the best of luck. So again, my name's Adam Thierer. I've spent 34 years doing technology policy in the intersection of emerging technologies and the regulatory state. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about what I think is one of the strangest ironies of our current political moment in the United States, which is this. On the one hand, there is growing consensus that America needs to start building again. You hear this phrase everywhere, right? And that we want an abundance agenda. In fact, one of the most popular books right now is the Ezra Klein and what's his name, Thompson book, Derek Thompson book, Abundance, right? And they talk in that book about the need to remove various types of policy obstacles to building again, growing, to getting more investment and innovation in our society. And so, many different pundits of all various political stripes are embracing this abundance agenda. So many institutions now are even renaming themselves, putting abundance in their title on the right, left, and in between. That's really exciting. At the same time, however, we see technological change and the freedom to innovate coming under attack from more quarters than ever before. This is especially true for the freedom to innovate in the digital sphere using various types of new computational technologies, algorithmic systems, or artificial intelligence. In fact, just one quick statistic on this, I'll have some more in a moment. In less than the first 4 months of this year, of 2025, as of this morning, there are 989 AI-related bills pending in the United States. We are about to hit 1,000 AI bills in less than 4 months. You do the math on that, I think that's around 10 a day. Never in my 34 years of covering technology policy have I ever seen this level of political interest in any given technology issue or any policy issue, period, like artificial intelligence. So, not all of those bills are regulatory, I should add, but a huge number of them are. And I should point out that most of them are state and local in character. Of those 1,000, only right now, about 50 are federal bills. So this is the mother of all regulatory patchworks we're talking about here, right? Every state, every locality having their own design for artificial intelligence. So this begs an obvious question. How does America hope to build again and have an abundance agenda when we are simultaneously going to war with the most important general purpose technology of our time? So that's what I'm discussing in a new essay that I'm actually writing for Ryan right now. Hopefully he accepts it. Okay, but I've written a lot about in my recent work at the R Street Institute in a variety of essays. And more generally, I use this as a chance to talk about this paradox of people they always say they want to embrace technology and change and everything else, but then talk is cheap and their actions are very different. They actually reject innovation in many different forms. So I should step back just a bit and say, as I pointed out, defending the freedom to innovate has been my life's work for 34 years, six different think tanks, going all the way back to my time at the Adam Smith Institute in 1991, through Heritage Foundation, Cato, and many others, and now R Street. And, I've been privileged to live through and write about and defend the information revolution. I mean, just step back in time, just briefly, for those of you in the room who are old enough, and if you're not, I'll tell this story. When I was born in the age of information scarcity, what was almost considered information poverty. And the primary consideration that everyone in my field of information and communications technology had was, how do we alleviate the scarcity problem? Well, we did it. We did it with the digital technology revolution. And now we live in a world of information abundance, almost information overload. So much so that everybody hates it. Everybody complains about it. On Joel's list of 10 problems, the 10th was information overload, right? So you have to ask yourself, do you want a world of information scarcity or information abundance, right? And so these days, there's a lot of folks who are starting to call into question the wisdom of the digital technology revolution. And it's really interesting because, of course, there's this broad-based so-called degrowth movement now growing in the world. People are attacking innovation and technological change and suggesting, we've gone too far. We should roll back the clock. We should stop economic growth and just learn to live within our means. Now there is a variant of the degrowth movement called decomputing, where they actually want to remove our ability to share and create information utilizing digital technologies. And so now the war on computation has commenced. And it is a war not just against AI, but high-powered algorithmic systems and computational systems of all sorts. Let me just give you a feel for, over the last 5 years, some of the ideas that have been pitched out there that I've been writing about. We have heard calls to, quote-unquote, pause AI, many of you remember this, through a global ban on computational advancement. Thousands of people signed an open letter to do this, including Elon Musk, guy who runs one of the biggest AI firms in America, called for a global 6-month pause on AI, whatever that means. Didn't even say who'd enforce it. There have been calls to destroy data centers by airstrike in countries that do not comply with such bans. That was an op-ed published in Time magazine 18 months ago. There have been calls for widespread technological surveillance and censorship systems for scientists and engineers engaged in AI development, such that it would even be required to weigh surveillance tags with the Orwellian name of freedom tags that would monitor them in real time to see what they were up to when they were developing AI and computational systems. Serious proposal. There have been proposals for government nationalization of supercomputing facilities such that they would be locked down and only a handful of people would be able to access them and do advanced computational science. And there's even been a proposal to create a so-called AI island where global governments would work to combine all of their computational power into one place, apparently somewhere in a mountain up in Geneva or something. It sounds like a Bond villain thing to me or something, but it would be exclusively controlled by global governments to basically make sure there was no risk associated with AI. The guy who wrote that paper later went to work as an AI advisor for the UK government. Not good. So those are the most extreme ideas. But let me talk to you about some of the other ones that are out there that are considered the moderate ones. We have seen proposals in the United States, including legislative proposals, to have a so-called Federal Robotics Commission, an AI Control Council, a National Technology Strategy Agency, an FDA for algorithms, and boy, I could go on. And I already pointed out the thousands of bills that have been introduced over the last couple of years, including 1,000 this year. Again, an unprecedented degree of interest in regulating an emerging technology. And in these bills, it's really astonishing because a lot of these bills, these proposals, don't even define artificial intelligence the same way. And then they have new arcane distinctions of AI developers, deployers, distributors, integrators, all sorts of new regulatory classifications about how entrepreneurs will have to come and basically be blessed before they can innovate in the AI space. So it's going to be really hard, I argue, to achieve a future-oriented, pro-growth, abundance agenda with so much regulation brewing for the most important emerging technology of our times. Now, what would we lose? Let's talk about very quickly opportunity costs here. What would we lose if we actually went to war with computational systems? Well, the first and most obvious one is lost economic growth and opportunities. This is the most important general purpose technology of our era, and it promises to really supercharge growth in many different important ways in productivity. Secondly, it could result in a lot of diminished health and human well-being types of outcomes. We've had 50 years of so-called wars on cancer and things like this and major efforts, cancer moonshots. And it's good that we're spending that money. I really do believe that. But ultimately, we're not getting very far for the amount of money we're spending. AI and ML, machine learning technologies, offer us the best chance in decades of actually getting out ahead of these chronic conditions and ailments that plague society. Third opportunity cost of all of this regulation would be undermining learning and communication. AI is artificial intelligence. It's an information communications technology, and therefore we're talking about the production of knowledge. These are knowledge systems, and they're also speech systems. And so we could have government basically holding back progress in terms of knowledge sharing and creation. And then fourth and finally is the potential for us undermining geopolitical competitiveness and security of our nation. This is something that Arthur Herman's written quite a bit about, and he's written a piece recently about our growing so-called AI Cold War with China and the danger that they could move ahead of us if we shoot ourselves in the foot at the beginning of this important technological revolution. Because what Beijing wants to do is embed their values in their technological systems and then export them to the world very aggressively. We can't have that happen. So those are the costs. So what are we going to do about it? What is our choice? What I argued 10 years ago in a book about, after all these years I've studied these issues, I said, what are all these debates ultimately come back to? And what it comes back to, whenever you have emerging technology policy choices being made, is a choice of two policy defaults. One of those policy defaults comes about because there's so many defenders of the status quo. Joel talked about this earlier, and Virginia talks about it in her book on Future and Its Enemies, that want to protect their particular status quo. What's the primary policy instrument they utilize to protect the status quo? It's the so-called precautionary principle. The precautionary principle basically holds that new types of change should be slowed or even stopped until such time as someone gives you a blessing to move forward. It's what I call a mother may I type of slip, or permission-based slip system for governance. The precautionary principle reflects a value preference of stasis over change, of stability and preservation of past policies, professions, business methods, or whatever else, over any sort of messy futures that might be coming about because of new technologies. And under the strictest application of the precautionary principle, innovators are basically stopped from developing altogether. They can be stopped through prohibitionary measures, censorship measures, line of business restrictions, whatever else. So in my book about the precautionary principle, I argued that the fundamental problem with the precautionary principle comes down to this, that living in constant fear of worst case scenarios and hypothetical fears means that many best case scenarios could never come about. That it's only by allowing trial and error experimentation and a certain amount of risk taking that we actually get progress and prosperity as a society. The precise way the precautionary principle derails progress is because it derails the learning curve. I don't know how many of you have ever read or heard of a book by J. Storrs Hall called Where is My Flying Car? But I encourage you to read it. It's been an incredible inspiration book for me. And he's a physicist, and he wrote about, why is it we don't have a flying car? We had the idea back in the 50s. We could have done this. Instead, we just ended up we stopped with helicopters and crummy planes, and we really stopped progress there. And he talks about how the same thing happened in the field of energy. And he basically points out that in some key fields, we instituted the precautionary principle, and what it then did is it derailed the learning curve and resulted in a substitution effect. Because as Joel taught us a moment ago, incentives matter. People respond to incentives, and if your incentives say, well, if you come into this field, you're going to have roadblocks everywhere you go. And brilliantly, what J. Storrs Hall does is he actually documents in some of these fields how you saw a substitute of lawyers going into that field while engineers went out of them. What a disaster for society. And that's basically what happened in the 70s in a lot of different transportation fields and energy fields. So that's why the precautionary principle is so problematic for a free society. Well, what are we going to do about it? Well, what I've argued, the antithesis of the precautionary principle, for lack of a better phrase, I use the term permissionless innovation. Permissionless innovation basically is just another way of stating freedom. The freedom to innovate, to go out and embrace new business methods and ideas to find new ways to build that proverbial better mousetrap. There have been other names for permissionless innovation. The philosopher Max Moore uses the term proactionary principle that asserts that, quote, our freedom to innovate technologically is valuable to humanity. The burden of proof, therefore, belongs to those who propose restricting new technologies. All proposed measures should be closely scrutinized. Elsewhere, I've reformulated Max Moore's proactionary principle as what I call the innovator's presumption. This is the idea that as a policy guideline, we should write into law that basically you are innocent until proven guilty. That basically, as I quote, and this is what I think should be written into law, any person or party, including regulatory bodies who oppose new technologies or services, shall have the burden to demonstrate that such proposals or innovations are inconsistent with the public interest. Right now, in many regulatory systems, the burden is on the entrepreneur or the innovator to prove that they should be allowed to go out. They are, again, treated as guilty until proven innocent. We should reverse that with the innovator's presumption. So I want to be clear. Permissionless innovation is not anarchy. It's not anything goes. We live in a system of rules. The best rules are what Richard Epstein calls simple rules for a complex world. We have, of course, many different remedies when things go wrong on the books already. Consumer protection laws, unfair and deceptive practices, recall authority, civil rights laws, common law remedies, torts, design defects law, breach of contract, property law, contract law. I could go on and on and on. All of these things exist, and they should exist. That's how we should remedy problems. But how do we do that? We primarily do that through a cost-benefit analysis of existing systems that are out on the market, and then we do an ex-post analysis, and we hit them with the books if something has gone wrong. That's the better way to generally do things, although there will be some times when a level of precaution is more necessary with certain technologies. But the bottom line is that should be the narrow case, not the broad case where we start. And interestingly enough, during the Biden administration, circling back to AI, a lot of the Biden administration's leading agencies, the FTC, the Department of Justice, the EEOC, the CFPB, they came out with a statement pointing out that all of the existing laws that they currently have on the books and that they enforce are already equally applicable to any algorithmic type of innovation. That basically, if you do harm using a computer or an AI, you're going to get hit with all of their rules. To which I applaud. I said, that's absolutely right. Now, why are you doing all these other crazy things to try to bottle things up out of the gates by design? Again, that's the difference between the precautionary principle and permissionless innovation. We want the more responsive approach. The Biden administration has said we can do it, but they also wanted a preemptive precautionary approach that bottled things up by design out of the gates with all sorts of new licensing regimes and different types of liability schemes and new agencies that I already mentioned before you could actually go about innovating. So let's apply this directly to AI. What does permissionless innovation have to teach us about how we should think about AI policy? Well, I think innovation defenders should look to foster a positive policy culture for AI and other emerging technologies, quantum and other types of important computational innovations, by advocating 4 freedoms. Number 1, the freedom to innovate using AI, the freedom to learn using AI, the freedom to code and compute using AI, the freedom to speak and express oneself using AI. Innovation defenders should simultaneously look to try to stop ideas or block ideas that involve that precautionary principle approach, such as AI-specific bureaucracies, new types of AI licensing schemes, AI-focused or automation tax schemes or penalties, and certainly international AI regulatory controls and treaty efforts. I have a big paper or essay I released recently on the trouble with AI safety treaties internationally and the proliferation thereof. So the question is, will policymakers rise to this challenge? Will they embrace a permissionless innovation model for emerging technology, including AI and computation, or is it all about the precautionary principle? I should just point out, we've had a really interesting real-world experiment over the past quarter century with these 2 models. If you go back 25, 30 years in time, you look where Europe stood versus the United States at the dawn of the digital revolution. Europe was very well situated at that time. Had a lot of the leading labs, a lot of leading thinkers and companies involved in the internet and digital technology. And so it was considered like a real race, kind of the race we're having right now with China. And then something interesting happened. Around 1996-97, Europe and the United States chose 2 different policy paths. Europe embraced the precautionary principle, employing rules like that continue today, like the GDPR, the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and now a new AI Act. And America took a very different approach, an approach rooted generally in a more permissionless innovation model with a light-touch, market-oriented governance approach for the internet and digital technology. So much so that the Clinton-Gore administration, in 1997, released what I regard as the single most free market-oriented governance document in the history of the United States, the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce, that basically said the internet and digital commerce should be treated as a flexible, market-oriented new type of technology and platform. Well, this was a wonderful thing to see how it played out. Economists and political scientists love to talk about natural real-world experiments. You want to look out at the world and say, hey, let's have 2 similarly situated jurisdictions. Let's see how they use 2 different policy regimes, and let's see what happens. Well, let's see what happened. I think you already know that the answer to this joke, right? I mean, the European Union became an innovation backwater. I always challenge my students and crowds, name me a little leading digital technology innovator headquartered in the European Union today. There are a couple. Anybody? There's a couple. There's ASML, there's Ericsson. Yeah, there's a couple. Some of them are a little bit old, right? Some people sometimes tell me Skype, and I'm like, okay, I'll give you that, I guess. Even though it's been owned by American companies for a long time, and it just went under. So here's the data. 6 of the world's 7 trillion-dollar companies are American, and all of them are major players in AI development. Europe has no major AI players and leading cutting-edge AI in the top 25. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, in 2022 alone, the digital economy generated in the United States $4 trillion of gross output for our nation, amounting to 10% of U.S. GDP. Of the world's 25 largest digital technology innovators, 16 of them are American companies, and it's very hard to find any Europeans on that list. We have luckily so far treated AI with this same permissionless regime, and it's had some positive results. In fact, just last week came out a survey, said in 2024, the United States invested, and this is private venture capital, not government money, private venture capital, $109 billion in AI systems. That's 11.7% greater, 11.7 times greater than China at $9.3 billion of private investment. And it's 24 times larger than the United Kingdom. These are astonishing numbers, right? Policy has consequences. Incentives matter. We gave our innovators a green light, and they took advantage of it. Europe just throws up constant stop signs, and they faltered. So what does this all mean? And I'll wrap up on this point. What does this all come down to? And what I think it comes down to is that freedom means forbearance. It means, and Virginia wrote about this, and I've got a quote from her here in my paper, that while dynamism requires many private virtues, Virginia said, its primary public virtues are those of forbearance, of inaction, of not demanding a public ruling on every new development. Amen. I probably quoted that line in more of my papers and books than anything else over the last 25 years, or however it's long since Virginia's book came out. The good news is that sometimes policymakers do get this. In 2020, before the first Trump administration left town, they actually released a guidance document for the regulation of artificial intelligence systems to its agencies through the OMB. And they said, quote, fostering AI innovation and growth through forbearing from new regulation may be appropriate in many cases, and that agencies should consider new regulation only having to decide that everything else has been exhausted and is absolutely necessary. Joel says in one of his other books from the past, The Lover of Riches, that, quote, technological progress requires above all tolerance toward the unfamiliar and the eccentric. I love that line. The unfamiliar and the eccentric. It means tolerating very different types of things that disrupt status quos. It means forbearance. That's what it all comes down to. Sometimes our policymakers, again, get this, but then they often directly counter it. J.D. Vance recently delivered an amazing speech in Paris about AI policy, saying that, quote, excessive regulation of the AI sector could kill a transformative industry just as it's taking off, and we are going to make every effort to encourage pro-growth AI policies. Wonderful. I praised it and said it was great. 3 days later, he appears on Meet the Press and says, we have to cut down these tech companies to their knees. We got to break them up. We got to do anything we can to stop the evils of the technology sector, which was very strange since those same tech companies that he was calling to be broken up and be cut down at the knees were in the White House just a few weeks prior promising $500 billion in investment in advanced computational systems for the United States. You can't really have it both ways. You need to either embrace the freedom to innovate or you're not going to get any. So I'll close with this by once again quoting Joel as well as my great hero, F.A. Hayek. And like so many great scholars of progress, they have utilized plant or ecology metaphors or analogs when thinking about innovation culture. And I think this is what's really important. Hayek suggested in his work that policymakers should aim to, quote, cultivate growth by providing the appropriate environment in the manner which a gardener does for his plants. And Joel, in Lover of Riches, says that we should think of innovation and economic growth as, quote, a fragile and vulnerable plant whose flourishing is not only dependent on the appropriate surroundings and climate, but whose life is almost always short. And he talks about the essential need to make sure we cultivate that growth again and again. I don't know how many of you have read James Pethokoussis' wonderful new book about progress, where he talks about, quote, public policy that helps create a better ecology for scientific and technological progress, business innovation, and high-impact entrepreneurialism. I love these metaphors. I love that vision, cultivating the garden. Well, one part of cultivating is getting the weeds out of the garden, making sure the plants can grow. And the one thing to circle back to where I started with the defenders of an abundance agenda that we all agree on is that need for clearing out the weeds from the garden. That's the good news. Lots of agreement there. But again, when you get into the specifics, when you start talking about what you particularly want to do about any of these things, we can be at odds. Virginia didn't mention it. I encouraged her to talk about it, but in her recent review of abundance, she talks about how she was confronted by Ezra Klein, who came out and proclaimed himself to be a technocrat, and that he wanted to plan progress of a certain way to get to abundance. And Virginia's whole book talks about, I love the term she uses again and again in her book, but sort of the inherent messiness of progress. And that its inherent unplannability, the spontaneous order that Hayek talked about, was essential to allowing interesting innovations to happen. When you try to be overly technocratic and plan it all, you often end up backfiring, even when your heart's in the right place, like Klein and Thompson with their abundance agenda. But it's not just them. I mean, I don't know how many of you read the works of Philip Howard, The Death of Common Sense. Brian Deese, former economic advisor for Biden, he had a recent piece about why America struggles to build, talking about progress requires flipping the script and creating a regulatory architecture that encourages more building, not less, and overcoming the status quo. Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, recently had an interview with Ezra Klein talking about the huge frustration of all of the regulatory underbrush that they struggled to get rid of when they were trying to pursue the various types of things like the CHIPS Act and industrial policy efforts. But the reality is that all of these are men of the left who all of a sudden are embracing abundance and the need for change, and yet none of them will utter the F word, freedom. They won't talk about freedom or another F word, forbearance. Instead, they want to micromanage it all into in existence. And so I would just end with that and say that, look, we should embrace abundance wherever we can find allies in this fight. But I would hope that we could get more people on board the idea, like the Clinton-Gore team showed us a previous generation could. And before them, the Carter administration, on many things, had the most sweeping sort of pro-freedom deregulatory agenda for creating an abundance agenda in the field of aviation and other things. It can be done. It's been done before, and it can be done again for AI. So I thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Adam. We'll go ahead. We have time for a few questions here. If you'd like to ask your questions of either Virginia or Adam or both, and just remember to have the mic come to you before you do.
I wonder if you could reflect a little bit more about what you call the precautionary effect in which people refuse to adopt the technology because they're worried about what its effects could be, and the failure of Europeans to use GMO crops, for instance, is a case in point. But I'd like to make a feeble argument in their defense. And also, I'm totally with you on this matter, as you well know. But I'm playing devil's advocate here. Behavioral economists tell us that people are particularly affected with what they call salient events. And there have been, as we all know, certain salient failures in which unexpected, unanticipated, unplanned effects of technology caused a great deal of harm. Okay, the example I give to my students, is the invention of asbestos as a major building material. But there are other visible effects that have turned people against innovation because it is well understood that if this is new, it may have effects that nobody knows at the time, or not even 20 years later. So you could call it the thalidomide effect. You remember the thalidomide case, but you could talk about the Fukushima effect, okay? And these are fairly local effects. And, the number of people affected by thalidomide wasn't very large, and it was only in Canada. I mean, this country actually, these regulators prevented the use of thalidomide, so it didn't happen. But people see this, and they go, my God, innovation can misfire, or it can bite back, as Edward Tenner memorably called it. And so I think the task is to somehow convince people that the alternative is worse. But that's not trivial, because people tend to be risk averse, and they tend to, look at these sort of salient events and jump into conclusions that may be unwarranted, but dangerous all the same.
No, absolutely. I agree with that very much. And this is a constant problem in the field of risk communication, which is that when you try to talk about complex trade-offs associated with the dynamic effects of technological change and potential harms thereof, sometimes you don't know what the future holds. And then when the future does unfold and there is some harms, you mentioned Fukushima. There's actually been some really interesting studies done on this about how many people actually died attributable to with deaths attributable directly to the nuclear side of this versus everything else that happened afterward with the evacuation. And the astonishing thing is that like most of the problems came after the fact with people like being relocated rapidly and not with the direct effect that people fear. Of course, we had this before at the 3 Mile Island effect, right? And we've had plenty of study of what that has meant for our energy outcomes and for cleaner environment. Right? We know what the trade-offs are now, but communicating that with risk analysis and cost benefit is really, really hard because the boogeyman that is up front about like mushroom clouds over our backyards kind of thing, and that will be on A1 of every newspaper, that concern, while the realities, the hard science, are buried on page B24, right? It just doesn't get nearly as much attention like the actual sound science. You mentioned GMOs. There's been extensive research on the golden rice case study. I don't know how many of you looked at that, but it's an astonishing thing, that fear of GMOs led to all sorts of environmental groups coming out in stopping the spread of golden rice to help feed people across the world with fortified rice. We could talk about millions of lives potentially being saved, right? But the concern about GMOs led to that being restricted in many different countries, many lives probably being lost, people still malnourished, and that being withheld. So this is an ongoing challenge of risk communication, cost benefit for economists, political scientists, innovation defenders. There's not an easy solution to this, but sometimes I try to spin it right back to people, and I even have a paper called "How Many People Died Today Because of the Precautionary Principle?" And I talk about let's talk about how many lives were lost because of inaction, because of not innovating, because of not allowing society to have other choices to choose from.
This isn't exactly an answer to your question, but I thought I would talk about asbestos because it's an interesting example. So asbestos is not really a new technology. Asbestos, no offense, goes back to the Romans. Had it, it's this miracle fiber, metallic fiber that can't burn, or prevents burning. And asbestos was widely used as long as building fires in particular, but then also on ships in World War II, where fire was a huge hazard. And I suspect if you went back to those people who had used asbestos in those contexts and said, you could have this risk of fire, or you could have this risk of mesothelioma, they would have gone with the mesothelioma because the fire was very immediate. Fast forward, what actually happens is you make progress against fighting fires, new construction materials, the environment in which asbestos was used changed. There was innovation in that direction. Fires become much less of a factor in cities. Don't get me started on fire departments and building codes. And you then go, oh my God, there's all these guys who worked it was particularly people who worked in shipyards in World War II, during World War II, who are developing these lung ailments. So that now we reverse. We don't use asbestos. We clean up asbestos. There are lawsuits and that sort of thing. That is an example of a kind of progress. Another example, environmental thing, I'm looking up at this green curtain. So before the development of synthetic dyes in 1856 was the first one, it was very hard to make green dye. You might think it would be easy because grass stains, but it's actually really hard. And that's why if you go to a museum and you look at an old medieval tapestry, all the grass is blue because they used to dye it yellow and then dye it with indigo on top of it, and the yellow fades over time. Anyway, so in the early 19th century, people figured out that they could use this arsenic-based dye to make green, and it became really, really popular. And there were stories about, guys wearing green socks and getting rashes, and it was used in wallpaper and stuff. And it really was terribly dangerous. Not so much if you just had green wallpaper, but it was a terrible occupational hazard. And there would be, often young girls working in, tenements, making green flowers for ladies' hats, and they would develop these really horrifying things. Well, people were concerned about it. There were scandals. There were, muckraking journalists. But what really got rid of those dangerous arsenic dyes were the synthetic dyes that replace them. And we don't have to worry about, I'm sure there's no arsenic in that green thing up there, So, well, I know. I don't think that would be left from the period, although it is sort of imitating the arsenic dyed green. So again, it's not an answer to how do you convince people that nuclear power is a good idea, although, well, maybe it is, because now we're seeing a lot more interest in nuclear power because there's this tiny little possible fear of nuclear this and that, which is mostly aging baby boomers. And then there's this much larger concern about climate change and how to transition from fossil fuels to other sources of power without making everybody miserable and poor. And so people are taking a second look at nuclear power, and there's innovation in ways of making it and that sort of thing too. So.
The two permissionless thing in the other one, you didn't mention any specific technologies that wouldn't really work in permissionless, like nuclear weapon development. Yeah. Biological weapon development, in which case 20 years ago you couldn't do that with the equipment you had, either biological or nuclear. It's just too hard a problem to solve. But you go forward 20 years and they have biological chips on a plate, where it could duplicate 1,000 different interactions real time, and you could work through all the problems on a little chip. And then, of course, nuclear weapons. Some of the newest nuclear reactors are saltwater or molten salt or small, about the size of a semi, and easy to get out there. And probably, if you look hard, you can find nuclear weapon development, especially with AI, being able to find all the different ways of making it optimized for size and cheapness and resources. You probably get to the point where unsavory groups could get their hands on these that they couldn't do 20 or 30 years ago. And you just have to have it done once. And I'm sorry, it leaps over this, well, we'll punish you. No. So there are some technologies that don't belong in the permissionless.
There's always a challenge with any dual-use technology that you are going to be confronted with the worst-case scenario being a truly horrific, catastrophic, and irreversible one. That is clearly what has led to really repressive controls on nuclear power broadly, right? But we made a mistake there. We didn't compartmentalize nuclear weaponry from nuclear energy production. Huge mistake for society that's had, unintended consequences for our environment and everything else. And this is a debate right now, this year, at this time, for AI, about computational power. And some of the regulations that I mentioned that people are advocating about full-blown surveillance of all scientists across the globe and Orwellian surveillance states and tracking of every chip that is sold is based on the idea of we've got to bottle these things up so that worst-case scenario doesn't come about. But that's not really going to work. It's especially not going to work for information and computational technologies that have a digital and intangible component. Because at least with nuclear power, you're still going to need centrifuges and have to have uranium, and you got to actually go through a process of building the weapon. But right now, you can just ask ChatGPT. I got on my phone. We can do it afterwards. Tell me how to build a nuclear bomb. It'll show you the recipe. Our government used to try to suppress that information. I actually met the guy who was at Princeton University, who was a student there, published it in, I think it was Mother Jones, like the recipe for how to build a bomb. The government came after him and tried to repress it after it was already out. And it was kind of silly. It was like, well, lots of nations know how to do this. The question is, do they have the materials and everything else to do it? So we have to actually draw some important lines with regards to dual-use technologies and take a look at the corner case and figure out how to address it. We certainly need to do it with nuclear weapons. We've had non-proliferation agreements with biologics. We've had conventions on this. But the bottom line is this. There's also another corresponding type of existential risk here. Arthur Herman writes about it in his most recent work, which is that we have the risk of autocratic authoritarian nations who could race to get these things first. So you think about the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, that we signed on to, the Soviets signed on to, and a bunch of other nations. The Soviets ran right back to Moscow and told their scientists to double down on biological weapon production. They stockpiled the biggest sitting stockpile of chemical biologics ever known to man. We found this out after the wall fell. And luckily, I'm pretty sure the United States wasn't paying much attention to that treaty either. And so we knew we could not shoot ourselves in the foot and tie our own hands and our own brains if our adversaries were racing ahead. Same exact thing is happening right now in AI and quantum. We absolutely cannot allow an adversary like the CCP to get ahead of us on this front. So yes, we need to have some guidelines, guardrails, whatever you want to call them at the margin for some of these things. But we have to understand there's multidimensional forms of risk at work here, and there could be a bigger existential risk than the one of like allowing large language models to be used by the public. And that could be the Chinese threat.
Yeah, I think also the threat, I mean, I worry about biological weapons. I mean, it's much easier to control things when you're only dealing with states. If non-state actors can do things, the only thing you can do is be able to react quickly, to be resilient, to use the same technology to create an antidote quickly or whatever, which does not prevent catastrophes from happening. It just means that, it's the level of recovery, because, I mean, I think that genie's been out of the bottle. We're kind of lucky nobody's done it. And you could do it with, you can do it with anthrax. You can do it. If you could get your hands on it, you could, a smallpox released into the current population of the U.S. would still be pretty devastating, because only old people like me have been vaccinated. So. On that cheery note.
I'm going to cut it off here, but please join me in thanking these for great comments.